Sometimes referred to as the Golden Age of ancient Egypt. The Old Kingdom, Dynasties 4 through 8, represent the period in time where we see the creation of the Great Pyramids at Giza, the evolution really of the pyramid into the structure that we know of when we look at these sites from an earlier series of prototypes, and also the standardization of the Egyptian canon. So this is a period in art history, particularly in ancient Egypt, where we see some really important conventions come together to create some of the most remarkable and some of the most historically relevant objects that we see during our studies. When we talk about the fourth dynasty in ancient Egypt, we're really talking about a family group. And one of these kings, these pharaohs, was a guy by the name of Snefru. And Snefru basically looked back at the third dynasty, looked back at the pyramid that Imhotep built for Zoser at Saqqara. And you may recall that it wasn't really a true pyramid, but in fact was a series of mastabas, which had been stacked one upon the other. Well, Snefru saw this, and he, of course, decided that he wanted to have one of his own. And his pyramids, of course, were designed from the outset as being true pyramids, rather than stacked mastabas. So the first of these he had built at a place called Meidum, and this pyramid was initially constructed, and then enlarged and enlarged. And we know this from today when we look at the site, because there are finished casing blocks in some areas that have then been built right over the top of with additional rough cut stone. So this tells us that it was roughly, laid out and then partially finished and then expanded multiple times. But it ended up being a failure. The structure just simply didn't work out. And as you look at the example here, you can see it doesn't represent what we typically think of when we visualize a pyramid structure. So this one was never completed and never functioned actually as a tomb for Snefru. So he didn't give up, though. His next attempt was a location at Dashur called the Bent Pyramid. And the reason it's called the Bent Pyramid today has to do with some errors, some issues with its construction. So this was really quite a large structure. And one of the things that happened here is, as you can see, if you look at the corners at the edges, it was started with a fairly steep angle. But the problem here is that this particular pyramid was not built on a solid foundation. It's basically on a foundation of sand. And as the pyramid was being constructed, disaster struck and it started to crumble. The corners began to crumble. They couldn't handle the weight. And there's some discussion, some theory that large parts of the casing actually fell off and probably killed large numbers of workers. But eventually the pyramid was finished, but it was finished at a greatly reduced angle. And so we see here this change. As it comes up this fairly steep side, the pyramid then bends and becomes less aggressive. This one was, again, not used. Snefru was not interred here. It was unstable, and so it was essentially abandoned. Snefru's third and final attempt, however, was the Red Pyramid. And the Red Pyramid is really the first true pyramid that we look at and discuss. It's perfectly constructed, wide base, gentle angle, and it is really quite large. It is actually only about 49 feet shorter than the Pyramid of Khufu that we see on the Giza Plateau. So that, of course, brings us to Giza. This brings us to the descendants of Snefru. And what we see when we're talking about Giza are really the most famous structures that we see in Egypt, probably some of the most famous buildings in the world. And these, of course, are the Great Pyramids of Giza. But one of the things that people don't seem to understand in many cases is that these monstrous constructions do not sit in isolation. It's not simply these three giant pyramids sitting out in the middle of the desert with nothing else going on. They're part of a much larger complex. So the first of these, the one that was built first, was built for Khufu, and this was built about 2500 BCE. And then following his descendants, then the next was built by Khafre and then by Menkaure. And each of these proceed to get smaller in size as we go down. Now, the Pyramid of Khufu, as well as the others on site as well, is, again, part of a much larger complex. And one of the things that's quite different from earlier examples, when we look back to, for example, the pyramid built by Imhotep for Zoser at Saqqara, there you have this very large precinct that's organized in a specific way to kind of allow for the recreation of things like the Hebsed festival. But this is quite different here. One of the things that changes during the Fourth Dynasty is that the kings begin to become associated with Ra and are sometimes actually referred to as the son of Ra. And so this association with the sun and with the solar cycle results in a change in the design and the orientation of their tombs. And one of the things that we see here is that the tombs are oriented on an east to west axis. And so they're on the west bank of the Nile, because of course that's where the sun dies every day, and they're part of that solar cycle. And so what we see is a series of different structures. We see a valley temple, which would have basically butted out to the Nile River when it inundated and flooded. You have a causeway, which connects from that to a mortuary temple or a funerary temple, which would be butted up against the pyramid itself, and then of course the pyramid, the tomb. And so this was intended to symbolize this journey, this process, every day as the sun rises and sets, and the kings were associated again with this solar cycle. So the pyramids themselves have quite a bit of symbolism, which is kind of interesting. They may be associated with the solar cycles we've already mentioned here, but also with a sacred stone called a benben. So the benben is a pyramidal stone which was located in the solar temple at Heliopolis, and it was believed to be the location in which the first rays of the sun fell. So it was this sacred object which was associated with Ra. And that's, of course, one of the potential symbolisms of the pyramid. Some people also believe it may have something to do with, when you have the sun break through the clouds and you get this kind of prism effect of light coming down. And that may, in fact, be kind of where the inspiration for the shape comes from. Of course, there are also the people who would look at this from a purely pragmatic point of view. And the honest truth is, if you're going to build something this big, you're going to be stuck with a wide base and a narrow top. And so, a pyramidal form like this is also really just about the only practical shape you can build when you're talking about building something that's 480 feet tall out of stone. So that's something to consider as well. So in addition to the pyramids themselves, though, the structures around them included tombs for other family members, including the pyramids of the queens, the small ones that we see arrayed near that of Menkaure, other family tombs as well, and pit burials. But we also see extensive decoration and statuary that would have existed in the valley and in the mortuary temples. Some of these have been found, but many of them are no longer existent. A few really remarkable things, though, have been located, like a diorite statue of Khafre that we'll be looking at a little bit later. So here we have a cutaway view of the Pyramid of Khufu. And when you look at this cutaway, you can see that there's really some fairly complex things going on here in terms of internal structure. A lot of people, kind of visualize these big mammoth grand tombs inside of these things, but in truth, they're really generally quite simple. Khufu's has a lot of different passageways and spaces within it, but these are not part of an original grand design. It's really pretty clear that when this was originally created, that the architect, which, by the way, was more than likely a guy by the name of Hemienu, designed these shafts and cut down in, and you can see the original burial chamber looks like it may have been under the pyramid here, but that chamber was abandoned. So these structures were started. We see that they began to work and then changed their minds to go to a different direction, and so we can see several different possible chambers created within the structure here. The final chamber that appears to have been the final resting place of Khufu is labeled on here as a number 5, the King's Chamber. But again, it looks as though that wasn't the original intent. So some other interesting things about this, there are some little shafts. You can see them numbered here as 9. These air shafts, apparently, that lead all the way out to the exterior. These are still quite mysterious today. Little remote drones have been kind of sent up there. Little remote control vehicles have kind of crawled up through those. We find their path blocked by little copper doors. So these may have been intended as a way for the king's spirit, or Ka, to be able to exit the building, to to travel and traverse along with the solar cycle. You can also see a series of small openings above the final chamber. These are relieving chambers. These are chambers that are designed as a way to help spread the weight out around this internal volume and help to protect the structural integrity of the king's chamber. Now, one of the really interesting theories, kind of crazy theories about the building of the pyramid, involves that long diagonal open space you can see there, number 4. This is called the Grand Gallery. Now, you got to remember that people were not really expected to be walking in and out of these. Once the sarcophagus was placed inside and sealed up, that was it. Nobody else was supposed to get in there. But this space, number 4 there, that chamber, is kind of oddly shaped. And some people theorize, one of the really interesting theories is that long hallway may have in fact been used as a shaft for a cantilever, basically for a sled, a big sled to slide down, pulling on a rope against probably a pulley or block and tackle, and moving blocks up from the exterior. One of the great mysteries, of course, is how are these things built? And one of the more recent and intriguing theories really involves using a counterweight system inside the pyramid to essentially assist in the process of raising some of the big blocks. Some of the other theories, of course, that are out there about how these may have been built include the use of ramps, earthen ramps on the exterior. It's pretty much impossible for these to have been done with a flat, long ramp. The ramp would be miles in length. It would require more material than was used to build the pyramid itself, and there's no way that there wouldn't be evidence of it present today. A quite possible concept, though, is a spiraled ramp, one that aligned with the faces of the pyramid, wrapped all the way around, and then was stripped away and removed as the final facing was applied. And that seems quite likely, but again, there's a lot of debate even today about how these were created, as no clear historical documents survive that describe the building of these structures. So here we are looking at an aerial view of the Giza Plateau and the pyramids of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. The largest of these three is, of course, that of Khufu, which is at the very top. Khafre is the next in scale and size, and then finally that of Menkaure. Now, the largest of these, which was the pyramid of Khufu, was in the range of 480 feet tall when it was originally created. It is somewhat shorter than that now due to a combination of erosion and also the fact that much of its facing, really all of its facing, has been stripped away and removed. One of the unfortunate things that we have to be aware of here is that structures like this from antiquity were often used as quarries for other places later in their lifespans. And so much of the fine granite and marble and limestone and other things that we see that would have originally faced buildings like these in antiquity have oftentimes been removed and used in other places. And that's really the case here. While we do see that there were different types of stone, including granite and limestone, used to face the pyramids, the majority of that is gone. We do have some that remains on the very tip of the pyramid of Khafre, that other than that, all of the original facing has been removed. Each of these different complexes, by the way, for these three kings, were not just done in a single monolithic, monochromatic, I should say, stone. When we look at them today, everything looks kind of the same. This kind of same, the color of the stone there that we see constructing the majority of the body of the pyramids. But they all would have been faced in really very, very striking and beautiful stonework. The causeways would have been lined with a variety of different types of stone of different colors as well. So we would have red granite, you'd have, of course, the white limestone. There was some black stone as well in some areas, like the diorite, another thing that we see for the statuary. And so these would have been much more vibrant, much brighter, and much more striking, really, in their original state than they are in terms of what we see today. Another simplified view here, looking down onto the plan for these three pyramids. And in the middle here on the bottom, you can also see a little kind of, anthropomorphic figure, really, which is the Sphinx, of course. And so we'll talk a little more about the Sphinx. But the Sphinx, as you can see here, is at the very end of the causeway leading from the pyramid of Khafre. Some people do theorize that it may in fact represent Khufu and may be older, but that's, of course, just a theory. We don't really know for certain. There are some historical documents at the base of the Sphinx, but these are actually from a later period, which we'll talk about, as there are some kind of interesting historical things which relate to the Sphinx that actually occur much later in the Egyptian timeline during the New Kingdom. So one of the other things that's interesting to note here is that during the time frame that these pyramids were created, We had, of course, the inundation of the Nile on an annual basis, and the Nile would actually reach all the way up to where these temples are located, up to basically the base of the Sphinx. And so today they do sit out in the desert, and the Nile does not get anywhere near there. However, back when these were created, there would have been water coming right up to these temples during the inundation. And one of the reasons this is important to note is because there's a lot of discussion about, well, how did they get the materials here? How was the stone moved from point A to point B? Well, quite a bit of the stone was actually quarried on site. We do see that there are places near the pyramids where the stubs of the stone blocks still remain. And that shows us, we can actually see how they were cut with copper tools by the workmen and harvested right there off of the plateau. Some of the pyramids, by the way, and the other structures here, are partially bedrock. The bottom course of Khufu's pyramid is bedrock. It's just been carved out. And the Sphinx is actually carved out of a natural spur of rock as well, out of living rock. But it does also appear that it's quite likely that much of the stone that was used was probably brought in by barge, brought down the Nile, floated right down the Nile, transported down the causeways, and then, of course, used on the site to construct the massive buildings that we see there today. So in the image we're looking at here, we can see an approach to the site and to the pyramids at Giza. And on the right-hand side in the distance, we can see the Great Pyramid of Khufu, and on the left, that of Khafre. One of the things that's kind of interesting to note is a common mistake is people oftentimes believe that the largest of these is the one on the left. And that's actually because it's on a slightly higher area of land. It's also closer to us in terms of perspective here in this image. But the pyramid on the right, that of Khufu, is in fact the largest. But as I mentioned previously, Khafre's is the only one which still retains some of its original limestone facing. Now in the next image that we're looking at here, you can see the Sphinx, the Great Sphinx. And the Sphinx, as I mentioned previously, is down at the end of the causeway, away from the pyramid of Khafre. And the Sphinx, as mentioned, it may in fact be the likeness of Khafre, but we don't really know. Some things about it, though, that are kind of interesting that people are not always aware of. It did at one point have the beard, the false beard that we often see on ancient Egyptian royalty. This beard has actually been located. It's in the Cairo Museum. But also another interesting point is that the neck has been modified. You can see that there are some kind of broad areas underneath the headdress which connect down to the body. And these are in fact not stone, but they're concrete that were placed there as a restoration effort in the early 20th century as a means to kind of try and salvage the structure. It's actually a fairly soft stone and has really suffered quite a bit from erosion and also from vandalism over the years. And so, there's really kind of some interesting stories we can associate with this structure. One of the most interesting of the stories we can talk about when we look at the Sphinx is about the dream stele. And so one of the things you have to realize is that we're really talking about something that happens much, much later. 1,000 years later, really. We're talking about during the Egyptian New Kingdom. And there's a young man who is a member of the royal family, but he's not the crown prince. He's not anywhere near really the royal succession. But he's a member of the family of Thutmose. And so this guy is camping out there, and he basically stays one night at the base here of this structure. And at this point, the Sphinx was buried in the sand, so it's really just part of the head sticking out. And so he camps there, and in the middle of the night, he has this dream. And in the dream, the Sphinx comes to him, and the Sphinx says, if you clear away the sand and you restore me to my former glory, I will make you king. And, so, who's going to turn that down, right? So he, of course, clears away the sand and asserts himself to kingship. There's some rather mysterious circumstances in terms of what happens to his other family members, older brothers, etc., and where they were at in the line for kingship, and what happens to them. But basically, he becomes Thutmose IV and becomes the king of Egypt. And so he erects a stele between the paws of the Sphinx, which is still there. And as a result, we have this interesting kind of transition, and he becomes king using the Sphinx as a source of legitimacy. So another interesting story that we can also relate to when we talk about the ancient Sphinx. So we've already talked previously about Egyptian funerary rites and beliefs and how that really functioned and how important it was for the ancient Egyptians to preserve themselves into the afterlife, into eternity. And associated with that, of course, we see some concepts regarding the preservation of the name, the preservation of the body. Mummification, of course, is part of that. But another part of that, of course, is the generation, the creation of Ka statuary. And we saw an example of that when we looked at the Ka statue that we found at Saqqara, which represents, of course, King Zoser. Well, there's some kind of enigmatic things about the pyramids at Giza regarding this, primarily really regarding Khufu. The strangest thing is that we don't actually see Khufu's name or image anywhere in his pyramid, which is really strange. The only exception to that, and the reason we know it belongs to Khufu, is some graffiti, which was apparently done by one of the men working in the tomb, and records his name up above the king's chambers, one of the relieving chambers. And so that's the only inscription we have. And as far as statuary, all we have is one tiny little statuette of Khufu. And so we don't really know what happened there. We don't know if the stuff was destroyed or if it never existed, or really why such a lack of material culture from that still exists today. That said, when we look at some of the other representative rulers from the site, we see some different things. One of the most important statuary items that have been recovered from the site is what we're looking at here. And this is a Ka statue of Khafre. And there are a couple things about this that are really kind of critical. One is that it's really quite large. It's 66 inches in height, and that's big, especially when you consider the fact that it's a seated statue and when you consider what it's made of. So this statue is made from a stone which is very closely related to diorite. It's not exactly diorite, but it's pretty close. And what's interesting about it is that it was transported about 400 miles down the Nile. And this is an incredibly hard, incredibly dense stone. And much of what has to be done in order to carve this is really abrasion. It's for the most part grinded into the shape that you see here. Remember, these guys had copper tools. And so carving into a stone like this was an incredibly difficult and challenging process. So when we look at this statue, when we look at this Ka statue of Khafre, another thing to keep in mind is that this is one of several that would have existed within his mortuary temple. And this particular one is one that was recovered and is relatively intact. Other fragments have been recovered, but this is the only one that's in this kind of condition. But there were enormous statues of the kings that lined the causeways and lined throughout the temples, and so much of that is just gone, just lost to us, or exists only in fragmentary pieces. And this one is really quite remarkable in the fact that it is, in fact, so well preserved. When we look at the statue, a couple of things that are interesting to note. We can see here on the side view of the throne this very rigid posture of Khafre. We can see below him is a symbol, directly below where he's seated. And that symbol is the intertwining of two plants. It's a papyrus and a lotus. And this is important because the two of those put together represent what we call a sematawi. And a sematawi is a symbol which represents the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. In fact, it's read that way. The symbol reads as sematawi, and that means the union of two lands. And so the intertwining of these two plants, which he is sitting on, represents his kingship, his rule over the two lands of Egypt. Some other things that are interesting to point out, if you look up the top of his head there, you can see he's wearing the nemes and the false beard and all of the other offices of kingship. But behind him is a falcon, and that's Horus. You can see the wings of Horus wrapping around his head in a protective gesture, also showing that he is associated with it. The statue represents really this triad of Osiris, Isis, and Horus. The throne is also the hieroglyphic symbol, the ideogram, really, for Isis. And in death, the king represents the ruler of the underworld, which is Osiris. So in this one image, all three of those divinities are actually represented. So in this image here, we can see a slightly different angle and a closer view, in fact, of Khafre. And looking at this, you can much more clearly see this rigid, permanent posture, the idealized figure. Again, Egyptian pharaohs were always shown as having this virile, youthful, perfect, flawless physique. It doesn't matter if they were in fact short and fat. They were always shown as being muscular, fit, strong individuals. What's interesting, though, is that the upper classes, and we'll see in some other examples here, are typically shown as pudgy because it was a symbol of wealth, but that wasn't appropriate for kingship. And so they're always shown with these very, muscular physiques. They're also always shown as being eternally youthful and really perfect. They're idealized. And we can also, again, here see the other symbols, such as the nemes, which is the headdress, and the false beard, which were, again, symbolic of the office of kingship. So we've seen some examples there of royal statuary, but we also have some examples we can look at of people who are associated with the court, but not necessarily royal. One of the best examples of these, and also a really important idea of what Egyptian conventions really look like in some of these other circumstances, can be seen here in these two. This is Rahotep and Nofret. And these two statues were created during Dynasty 4, early Dynasty 4, and they are made of painted limestone. So these are, again, Ka statues. And these Ka statues, like the one for Khafre, or like the one for Zoser before, are functional. They're intended to be a vessel, a resting place for the Ka, for the spirit. And so these were part of an important series of rituals and ceremonial processes, including something called the opening of the mouth ceremony. And once you do that, then it creates a house, a home, where the spirit could, in theory, exist forever. And so the beauty of these and the permanence and the style and the way these are created is really all done in a way to enhance that, to make these a permanent abode for the spirit. And so in that way, they're oftentimes not really intended to be a realistic depiction, a representation of the deceased, but instead a symbolic representation of who and what they really were. So these two images, though, here, of this married couple, really gives us an idea about some of the key conventions that were utilized by the Egyptians. One of the main things you'll notice here is that Rahotep is much, much darker than his wife. And this is because Egyptian men, when painted, and this is a great example, by the way, because not many of these things still maintain their original paint, even though many were painted. But Rahotep here is shown as much darker than his wife. And this was a standard convention because the way that what this is really intended to express is that men were outside. They would go out of doors. And because they were outside and basically out in the world, they received more sun, so they're darker. They get more tan, whereas the women were relegated to a domestic life. And so women were often represented in a much lighter skin tone. Now, one thing that's quite unique here, though, about Nofret and really shows her power and her importance is the fact that she is basically created on the same scale as Rahotep. That's because she was an important priestess. It's not uncommon to see cases in Egyptian statuary where the man is gigantic and the wife is tiny. And that's because hierarchical scale was often utilized. Another thing that I'll point out here, which is kind of interesting, if you look at Nofret, she appears to be wearing a rather slim, slender type of fabric, really. You'll notice that whatever she's wearing is paper thin, right? It looks like she's wearing silk. You can see her anatomy clearly through whatever it is that she's wearing. Now, what's interesting is that the Egyptians primarily used linen. So that's not linen. They didn't have silk. They didn't have, spandex or whatever it is that she's wearing. And so we got to ask ourselves, well, why is she wearing something so form-fitting and so revealing? And the truth is that the Egyptians didn't have anything like that. And the real reason behind this is because it's intended to emphasize her femininity and fertility. And so this is another convention. We often see women shown in skin-tight clothes as a way to represent and to emphasize their femininity. And so this is done in a way that, in this case, again, emphasizes these conventions rather than representing a true and accurate depiction of anything that might have really, truly existed. So here we have another set of statuary to look at. This is another one of our kings from the Giza Plateau. This is Menkaure and his wife, Khmer-Nebti. And this one is carved from greywacke, so this is a different type of stone, but again, a very hard, very durable stone. And as we saw a moment ago when we looked at Nofret, if you look at what Khmer-Nebti is wearing, it again is skin tight. It appears to be painted on. And again, this is intended to be symbolic of and representative of femininity. Now, a couple other important conventions you'll notice. Look at the rigidity of these figures. Look at Menkari's arms and fists. This is intended to be so permanent. You don't want to stick fingers out there and arms out there because they could break off. And this is all about permanence. It needs to last forever. Another thing you'll notice is that Menkari has one foot striding forward. Now, this is done in a way to represent the man's ability to go forth in the world, to show his forward momentum. Sometimes the women are completely motionless. Sometimes, as we see here with Chimera Nebti, they have one foot kind of gently forward, but never in the same level of dynamicism as we see with the men. This also illustrates, by the way, a real shortcoming when it comes to the Egyptian ability to represent anatomy in a naturalistic way. The only way this really works, if we look at Menkari there, is if his left leg is in fact longer than his right. You can look at his posture, it's rigid and upright. He's not actually leaning forward or shifting his weight. That leg just seems to be growing forward. We also see there's no space between the legs. There's a solid block of stone. And again, this is tied to that idea of permanence. You don't want it to break, so you make it really thick and heavy. Something else to note, you'll see that the Chimera Nebti is reaching her arm around his waist. This is really intended simply to show that they're married. It's not really a sign of affection. In fact, the two don't really seem to be all that focused on each other, but instead, here we see a focus on this a sense of rigidity, permanence, establishing the canon and the conventions, and at least the symbolic representation of the fact that the two are, in fact, married. So let's look at a statue that's really quite different. This is a seated scribe, possibly a guy named K, from his mastaba at Saqqara. And yes, during the Old Kingdom and even later, they still continued to use mastabas. Unless you were king, you didn't get a pyramid. So mastabas were a much more common type of burial, which were used for people of the upper classes and nobility and members of the royal court who weren't necessarily king. So K is shown in a very different set of conventions. He's sitting down cross-legged, and if you look at his body, he's a little on the heavy side. We can see he's kind of pudgy. And this is actually intended to be symbolic of the fact that he was wealthy, well-to-do, important. Now, these types of conventions, showing the figure with this, kind of overweight anatomy would never have been appropriate for a king. But it is completely acceptable to show this when we're talking about someone who has an important function within the royal court, like that of scribe. And so this demonstrates his wealth, his importance, and his significance. Another example that we can look at here and talk about the Egyptian canon and how it functions. One of the other tombs that was found that really illustrates some very interesting examples of this was the tomb of T from his mastaba at Saqqara. So T was another important guy. He was another member of the court. And here he is shown on a hippopotamus hunt. So there are some really kind of heavy things going on here that are kind of interesting. First off, look at the size of T compared to anybody else. Not sure how that boat is floating, but he's gigantic, and he's standing up in this boat. He's shown in an extremely rigid formal posture. You can see the combination of frontal and profile views, but all the other people around him are not. They're much smaller than he is. They're shown in a much looser form of representation. You can see they're not in strict profile. And that's because they don't represent specific people. They don't represent individual people who are buried in this particular tomb. They're general, random people who work for T, you could say. And so the hippo hunt is a symbolic concept. So is agriculture. So is all of this stuff in the Egyptian world. It's really common to see scenes like this, symbols like this, of people in their tombs doing things like hunting hippos or planting grain, In a case like this, like with T, he's not physically doing it. He's overseeing. He's watching people do it. And the reason for this is because one of the most important concepts in Egyptian beliefs really was this idea of conquering nature. Nature was this unruly, unordered beast that had to be tamed. And so we see scenes in tombs that represent the conquest of nature, enforcing order into chaos. And so that's one of the things that's represented commonly. And people who aren't of a higher social status, people who aren't important, are shown as these kind of general cookie-cutter figures, like we see here on the right side with the boat, with these guys thrusting their spears into the water. And even down below, you can see the water teeming with all sorts of life, including fish and some rather small-looking hippopotami. So here's a representation of the Egyptian canon, the proportions that are used. You can see how these would be applied to the subject. The artist would draw a grid on the wall, then various body parts would be put at very specific points on this network of squares, including, the head, the shoulders, the waist. And these all had a predetermined space and place and size within the scheme. And this same approach was used for thousands of years. By the way, these were rarely executed by one person at one time. You'd have one individual who would go through, would lay out everything, the initial compositions, or even a team of people. Then you would have someone who was more of an experienced expert who would go through with a different color of charcoal and would make corrections to those drawings. Once those corrections were made, then another team would come through and carve. After the carving was done, another team would come through and paint. And so this is really kind of a division of labor, and these were broken down into very specialized areas of expertise. Another example here, also from the mastaba of tea. This is goats treading seed. And once again, these cookie-cutter figures are intended to show the dominance over the chaos of nature, and not intended to show any specific individual person. Another function behind objects like this, images like this in the tomb, was to provide for the Ka. By having things like food and beer and other items created visually, by having them created symbolically in the tomb, they were therefore available to the deceased in the afterlife. So if you've got stuff like this going on in your tomb, the creation of all this food, then the food's there for you. It's available when you're dead. And so that's another one of the reasons why these are represented. So we're going to talk a little here about the Book of the Dead and some of the spells and the imagery and some of the symbolic things that go on within these tombs. So we've already talked a little bit about some of the concepts associated with Egyptian funerary rites. But one of the most common things to talk about and look at here is kind of how the imagery within a tomb relates to this whole journey, to this process. It's a scary process, really, for these guys. You've got this whole thing you got to go through, and if you don't make it, well, if you're not found worthy, then it's bad news for you. You get devoured in eternity. So you've got to have all of this stuff in place. And the Book of the Dead was kind of like an instruction manual for that. It had all the spells and all the good stuff you needed in order to ensure a safe passage through the afterlife. Lots of things, like to prevent you from being sat on by a hippopotamus. That's actually one of the spells that's in there. But this in particular here is really the heart of the whole process. Literally, this is the weighing of the heart ceremony. So when you died, you would, your heart, of course, has already been removed from your body if you're mummified anyway, but the heart would then be placed onto a scale, and it would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the feather of truth. And if your heart was found to be heavier than the feather of Ma'at, well, then that was bad. And the guy that you see over there on the right-hand side with the hindquarters of a hippo, with the front of a jaguar, and the head of a crocodile, that's Ammit, Ammit the devourer. And if your heart was too heavy, then Ammit would devour you, and that was it. So here we see Thoth watching over the weighing of the heart. Anubis is actually conducting the process, and then of course on the left there, just on the edge of the composition, we can see the deceased. Above we can see Osiris, as well as several other members of the pantheon who are watching over the process, receiving also gifts and offerings from the deceased. It never hurts to pad that a little bit. And of course then we see the process concluding there, and the weighing of the heart taking place. Here we have another part of this. We have offerings of incense being given by a deceased individual in another example, given to Khepri, who was the god of creation, the sun, and rebirth, and also to Osiris there, and Horus, you can also see on the right-hand side. This is an image from the tomb of Nefertari, and again, part of this funerary process. You can see on the far right Nefertari, and interestingly, Nefertari is much bigger than any of the goddesses in this painting, which kind of says a little bit about Nefertari's importance. But here she is giving offerings in those jars, those votive offerings, and she's handing those out there to Isis, Serket, and Hathor. So this is a scene from the tomb of Sen-Nezem, and this is a representation of mummification. We can see a priest here wearing the guise, or the dressings, really, of Anubis, and going through the mummification process. This is a process that took 70 days, was quite extensive. It included the removal of all of your internal organs. Most of these were then placed into a series of sacred canopic jars. You were wrapped in fine linens, which were then laid with with all sorts of spells and incantations and scarabs and other things to protect you in the afterlife. But you were fully desiccated and dried out by natron salt during this process. So your body was in fact preserved. And again, this was part of this mummification process. Another image here. This is also an example of the weighing of the heart. On the far right here, you can see Ammit once again. You can see Thoth. You can also see on the left-hand side the scales. And so this was a very common type of image which is represented in the tomb. And of course, the idea is that by representing this and by presenting this within your burial process, that maybe it's going to weigh in your favor, and you're going to have hopefully some influence on the outcome. And finally here we can see offerings to Osiris from the deceased. You can see the pile of goodies there being placed before the dead king. And Osiris, by the way, one of the ways to tell Osiris most easily, looking at images in scrolls or paintings in tombs, is he's often represented as having a bluish-green pallor, indicating, of course, that he is dead. So he's often easy to pick out in that respect. But once again, you can see the throne here, and if you look down on the right side of the throne, you'll see again that Semetawi, the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt represented, and showing Osiris as king overall. So the Old Kingdom, again, as we've talked about here, it's the period of the development, really, of the pyramid. This is the age of pyramid building. It's also when we see the key conventions and concepts of Egyptian art codified. It's when we see the canon really tied down and centralized. So that's really important to